Hi, Rob B here with Rob D. And yes, you are listening to the Property Podcast. Now, doing a refurb project, that's pretty tough at the best of times. But what if you were doing a refurb project in the middle of lockdown? And then imagine you were doing more than one. How would you handle it? Well, this week, we've got a guest who's been through that experience and is going to share it with us all.
Welcome to the Property Podcast, where every Thursday investors come to be informed and inspired. I love these episodes where we speak to a real investor who's out there doing projects and finding out what life is like for them right now. So that's what we've got coming up. It's going to be a great conversation. And make sure you stick around after that, because in Hub Extra, I'm going to be sharing a book that I've absolutely loved.
So time for our news story of the week. And Rob, what's grabbed your attention this week?
Yes, good news this week for investors in Scotland and Wales. Each country has its own version of stamp duty, though each called something slightly different. And initially, when England and Northern Ireland announced the extension in the zero rate band of stamp duty, Scotland and Wales didn't. But in the last week or so, they have. The threshold in both countries, where you have to pay nothing at all, has been extended up to 250,000. That's lower than it is in England, but the reason for that is that property prices are generally lower. So the idea is that roughly the same percentage of properties end up falling within the zero rate band. But it's not purely good news. In Scotland, just as in England and Northern Ireland, investors still have to pay the surcharge, which in Scotland is 4%. In Wales, it's even worse because you have to pay the surcharge, and property investors are actually exempt from the extension in the band. So the changes that they've made only apply to people who are buying their own residential property. Brutal. So across the UK now, there are benefits to investors to different extents. But even in cases like Wales, where investors don't directly benefit, these changes are still going to revitalise the market and get things moving, get more transactions happening, which is good news for everyone. A couple of episodes back, we heard from serviced accommodation investor Chris Ryder on how COVID-19 and the lockdown has impacted his business. And we had such a great response from that conversation, we decided to follow it up with another investor with very much with boots on the ground. Because weathering the pandemic has been tough enough, even if all you're doing is maintaining some buy-to-lets. But today's guest, Natalie Gascoyne, has got a lot more than that on the go. She's the owner of Davis Properties, and with that company, she's tackling all sorts of projects, ranging from buy-to-let to HMOs. And she's currently got 2 commercial to residential conversions on the go. How will those have been affected by everything that's going on right now? Well, we are about to find out. So thanks for taking the time to chat to us today, Natalie. Do you want to start off by telling us a little bit about how you got started?
I began as kind of what I call a professional property investor in 2017. So at that time, I'd been working in music and sports marketing for about 8 years. And then that summer, I left my job in marketing. And since then, I've worked kind of 2 days a week in marketing as a consultant, and then the rest of the time, so 5 days a week really, I spend on my property business.
Right.
Yeah, so for the first 2 to 3 years, I focused on HMOs. So I was originally starting with buy-to-lets because that's where I felt most comfortable in. I already had a buy-to-let that had been sourced for me when I was working in marketing, or that I bought off plan. But I quickly realised that when I left marketing, my salary had literally halved because I was, moving on to kind of two days a week. And I had a lot of monthly income that I needed to generate back. And I realised that if I was doing this just via buy-to-lets, that process would take much longer because naturally the cash flow that you get from a buy-to-let compared to a HMO project is significantly lower. For the first 2 to 3 years, I was focusing on mainly building that income. So I moved my focus to doing mainly HMOs, but then I also did some project management and sourcing of HMOs for other investors to get that kind of project management and sourcing fee to build my income. And then more recently is when I've chosen to move on to kind of commercial projects. So I think, you guys know in Manchester, the market is extremely competitive. It's still competitive in commercial buildings, but it's, just slightly less than in the residential market. And in commercial, you just get a lot more space for your money. So you can, create more rooms if you're turning it into a HMO, or more flats if you're turning it into kind of individual dwellings. And I just find the transformations of commercial much more exciting. So I guess changing an office or a shop to a residential flat, there's quite a big impact and a big change in the building. So I get a lot of satisfaction from seeing those renovations as well.
So you've had a bit of a taste of a few strategies and now you're pivoting and I guess specialising in a bit of a niche area of investing. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's a combination of both, really. So I generally look for buildings that are around 3,500-ish square foot or less. And then I'm really particular about my areas now. I think, everything that's happening with COVID has made this drive even bigger. But I'm very particular, and I tend to focus in key areas that don't only rent well, but that I can also see a lot of capital growth opportunity as well. So I'll look for kind of offices, shops, or mixed-use developments in those areas, the small to medium-sized ones, that have the opportunity to either change in full to residential or change to mixed use and, keep a commercial aspect on the ground floor.
That's a really interesting strategy. Can you tell us a bit more about the projects you've got on the go at the moment?
Yeah, so at the start of the year, we had kind of 2 commercial developments going through. Kind of the week COVID hit, we were about to exchange on these 2 properties. And, I think it can be an extremely painful process in conveyancing. So we'd been through that whole pain. It had taken months and months, and we were about to exchange on these 2 properties. And everything in that week before was, kicking off about COVID, and there was lots in the news about the market and, businesses struggling if lockdown happened, and a lot of negativity, which naturally made me kind of relook at what we were doing and just made me slightly concerned. So the 2 developments that we were looking at, one was a commercial to residential flip almost. So it's in a lovely village town in Cheshire, and we were going to create a townhouse and a duplex apartment to sell on to either first-time buyers or young professionals. And then the other development was a commercial to residential development in Trafford, and that was to keep for the long term and rent out, because Trafford's hugely popular with rents. So when COVID happened, I kind of stalled on both the purchases. I didn't kind of go ahead and commit to the exchange. I'd already invested, thousands already in surveys and plans and solicitors' fees for both the properties. So I didn't want to panic and pull out completely. I just kind of held my nerve, but I wanted a bit of time to see how this was going to play out and listen to what a lot of credible market analysts were saying over the coming weeks. Obviously, the media was very worst case scenario, but, I've learned to not, take that with a pinch of salt and actually, read the market properly and listen to people who, who've been looking at this for years. The purchase price that I'd had agreed on both of them, it meant that I had, significant equity in both of them. So I was kind of covered for any market drops, but it just meant that I would be leaving more money in the projects if the market did drop. And I'm really cautious and quite worst case scenario. So I just kind of decided to wait. And then a few days later, the private investor we were working with for the Cheshire development, they had to pull out because him and his partner's jobs were both at risks, which, is completely understandable. They needed to feel like they needed to protect their money. And banks weren't lending at that time at all. So that one was kind of on hold. And then a few really positive things happened. So the seller of the Trafford development, they really wanted to exchange in the last tax year because they were selling it as part of a much wider group of properties. So because of that, and to get us to commit to the sale, we negotiated a 15% discount on that building. So the price dropped from 185,000 to 156. So that's like a 30,000 cost savings we made. So
wowzers.
Yeah, and it's super cheap for the location that it's in Stretford. It's ideal for capital growth and rental demand. So there was, many different exits for that building. So as a worst case scenario, I could have just sold it on, weeks later to another investor. So yeah, we went ahead with that one. And with this one, we're actually doing a new strategy for the kind of end tenant. So rather than providing accommodation for professionals, we're partnering with a supported living provider who's going to use that building for their tenants who have extra care needs.
So you have 2 pretty big projects on the go at the same time. Both are pretty time and labour intensive. Would it be right to say that the social distancing and the lockdown brought everything to a grinding halt?
The Trafford one we've now completed on. So we exchanged in last tax year for the vendor. We did delayed completion to June. We've received the planning, so the refurb on that's happening next week. And then the second project, which is the development we're doing in Cheshire, we're completing on that this week. And because it's been so long in the conveyancing process, we've already got the planning. We've got a build team, desperate to get on site and raring to go. We've spoken with all the utility companies, like all the various, we've got, kitchen quotes, everything has been done, ready to go with that project. So we should hopefully have teams on site in the next couple of weeks.
So you're expecting build teams in right away?
Yeah, so that's definitely the case in these two projects. I know that a few of the build teams that I've been talking to, there's been quite a shortage of materials. So things like plaster has been a nightmare to get hold of. So I'm just factoring in that the refurb might take slightly longer, and you've just got to work with your builders and, build a strong relationship so that we can minimise that impact together. There's lots of work, pre-plaster stage that we can get on with. Because of the way it's fallen and because we delayed the completion of both of these projects, hopefully the actual refurbishment, we shouldn't be impacted too much.
Wow, so by the sound of things, you managed to keep the wheels turning and being quite proactive during the lockdown with getting plans approved and getting all that paperwork taken care of. It doesn't sound like you've been wasting your time.
No, definitely not. And, we use that time. That's when we were kind of building the relationship with the provider for Trafford. And I think with all the sites, the teams are going to be respecting the social distancing measures. Both of the buildings are big enough that they're able to do that. It's not like you kind of trying to fit in a team of 5 into a small extension, a small extension refurb. So I'm confident that in terms of the teams working together on site, that shouldn't be too much of an issue. But again, in terms of timings, we have factored that in, and that is a risk that we've considered, and we've just chatted through various ways to kind of mitigate that.
So even though you've been doing this for 3 years, which across your life doesn't seem like a long time, but you've clearly gained a huge amount of experience in this time working across so many different strategies. Have you had to adjust the things that you were doing to suit this current situation?
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely had to go back and look at how we're approaching things commercially and just looking at the figures. So overall, we've done fine because I always have kind of multiple exits for projects. I have kind of a worst case scenario approach. And you have to, particularly when you're working with private investors. There's a group that I'm in called Property Sisters, which is like a network of female investors around the UK. And there's a saying that one of the ladies has in that, which is treat your investors' money like you're borrowing from the Russian mafia. And I just completely live you have to, the absolute worst case scenario for me would be if something happened in a project that caught a private investor off guard and it meant that we had their money for longer than they were ever expecting, or, we weren't able to give them their return at the time we had committed to. So we always have multiple exits to kind of really avoid that scenario as much as we possibly can. In terms of things I am changing, it's when we're looking at the GDV. So I'm looking at around 10% lower than what I would have put in maybe January or February when we were analysing numbers. But because we purchase in high demand areas, so for example, Trafford and Stockport, I personally don't think it's going to go to 10%. But again, that's why there's no real set rule in terms of, what should everyone be reducing their GDV by to protect them, because it's so dependent on the location and so dependent on the type of building. And if I was looking at a commercial GDV on a large HMO or building that had multiple office units in, I'd likely make it more 15 to 20% lower, even in Manchester. So it's just, it really does range, and there's no kind of one answer fits all. But in terms of, because we are focusing on such strong locations that have such high demand, and we're doing buildings that are in high demand in those areas, there's a lack of stock. I'm comfortable at doing it around that 10% mark.
So being so active in the market, you're in a really good position to give us some insight into what's actually happening on the ground. So how are you seeing the effects of the pandemic playing out? Is there a lack of interest in the market? Do things feel like they stalled a little bit?
Yeah, no, I'm definitely seeing in Manchester still a lot of competition. So a lot of the properties that we've been to view, both residential and commercial, have had a lot of interest. I wouldn't know if I'd call it a recovery. I think it's more, there's a lot of pent-up demand from when people couldn't do any viewings in lockdown. So I think this was always going to happen. that once lockdown was up, there would be a lot of people naturally viewing and wanting to move and wanting to get on with things that they missed out on in March and April. Rental demand at the moment is huge. Our lettings agent that we work with have said they've never seen rental demand like it since when lockdown lifted, which is really positive. However, I don't feel that we're really going to see the true impacts until maybe end of Q3, Q4 this year, when the furlough is officially over. And, this pent-up demand from when we were locked down has kind of been ridden out.
While we realise you don't have a crystal ball, what do you see happening over the next 6 to 12 months?
Yeah, I listen to a lot of market analysts, so including the Property Hub podcast. So I kind of listen to all sides and try and just get myself as educated as possible. And there's various reasons why I feel this is very different to kind of the 2008 crash. One, the government is pumping, a lot of money into the economy, and the availability of credit is going to be really key to this recovery. And the banks are in just a much better and healthier position now than they were in 2008. That's not to say that I don't think there's going to be any kind of drop. A lot of this is going to depend on the appetite for lenders to lend, and also on the levels of unemployment as well. Once the furlough scheme is officially over. No one knows really. No one has a crystal ball. So I think you just have to educate yourself, leave enough contingency in your numbers, and look at property long term. Everything we're purchasing at the moment is long term. It isn't a get rich quick or potentially get poor quick. If I'm buying this HMO in Trafford, I plan to own it for the next 15 to 20 years. So that's going to ride out any market waves. But I guess what I'd say is don't have too tight margins, and don't do your numbers judged on you refinancing in 6 to 9 months at a certain GDV, because one, you might not have lending products available, and two, your GDV might not hit the amount that it needs to reach. So, and also I think there's going to be a lot more investors moving into property. The sharp ups and downs of the stock market in comparison to property that's held up quite well in the recent months has made it quite an attractive asset. And similarly, if negative interest rates are going to happen, anyone who has, money in savings accounts, that they need to put their money somewhere, and property seems more secure.
You seem like you're still really positive on property investment over the long term for the next 5, 10, 20 years. And it sounds like you've not really got any concern about carrying on, even if it means you need to be a bit more cautious over the next 6 to 12 months.
Yeah, definitely. We're significantly more cautious. If we're looking at a project like the mixed-use building we're doing in Stockport to residential, although that's in a really popular area, we are looking at maybe 10% or less GDV. And then on top of that, we're doing much more contingency in our refurb numbers too. So we're being really cautious with figures, but we're still definitely ploughing on if we can get properties at the right price. At the start of the year, it was just nearly impossible to find good deals in the areas that we're looking at. It was just so competitive. And I do think that once COVID is under control, that might not happen for another year. I still think that if you kind of have a good building in a good area and you're looking at it for the long term, I think as long as you're careful with your numbers, there shouldn't be too much of a risk there.
Natalie, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate you coming on and telling us about your journey, your experiences, and your insights as an active investor. Just before we wrap up, what would you say to anyone who's starting out on their own property journey, especially with regards to what we've seen happening over the last few months?
Yeah, I think if I was starting out now, obviously everything that was going on in the media and in the press and what people are saying in social media, it naturally would, put me off quite a lot. That would have quite a big impact on me. But, you're starting a new business venture, it's daunting anyway, but to do it when everyone is saying online not to, that's a big hurdle to overcome. But I think knowing what I do now and knowing how competitive the markets have been and how difficult it is to find deals, if you're well educated, this is a great time to start. So when I started, the market was rising and it was really challenging to find deals. It still is. Everything was going for asking price or over. But I think there's going to be this kind of window of opportunity towards the end of the year and maybe the start of next year to be able to get some reasonable prices. At the same time, I'd really recommend getting educated. So yeah, I would just say definitely now is a good time to start, and I think that it's going to be much easier to find deals. However, again, I think you need to be very educated and really lean on people who have that experience.
So it's time for Hub Extra, the part of the show where we give you a bit more, and it's all backed up by our weekly email, which you can get for free by signing up to the Property Hub website. This week, I'm pretty excited because it's a book, and I love it when we get a book recommendation, and I've got something new to read. So thank you, Rob. What are you recommending? And I'm off to download it right now.
Well, you should, because I'm calling this as my book of the year already. I don't see how this is going to be beaten in the next 6 months. It's called A Bit of a Stretch, The Diaries of a Prisoner. And it's by someone called Chris Atkins, who I hadn't heard of. But it turns out I had actually heard of a few of his films. He's a documentary filmmaker who got tangled up in one of those tax avoidance schemes to do with the film industry and ended up getting sentenced to 5 years in prison, which seemed pretty harsh. But I know this sounds awful, but I'm glad he did, because he's written a really amazing book off the back of it. It's based on the diaries he wrote while he was inside, and it gives such an amazing insight into what life in prison is actually like, because most of us, hopefully, will never find out. And I had no idea what it was like. And from things that you see in the papers, I had the impression that if you're a white-collar criminal, you get a fairly easy ride. Not the case, as it turns out. Some of the things he describes in this book are truly shocking, and it's really good to understand a bit better what's going on and, to be frank, how badly it's failing in many ways. So I listened to it on Audible, where the author narrates it. He's a naturally funny and charismatic guy, so it comes across really well with him reading it. So I thoroughly recommend it, because you get to learn about an important topic that you probably don't know anything about right now, and you get to be entertained while doing it.
So that's us done for another week. Thank you for listening. Remember, you can follow us on all the social channels. Search for @PropertyHubUK, and you will find us, and you will find what we're up to. But I can tell you what we're up to next Tuesday. We'll be back with Ask Rob and Rob, and then, of course, back next Thursday with the Property Podcast. So until then, take care, everyone. Have fun. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.